Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about the Russian economy, and specifically to look at the official figures that have now been posted for the full financial year ended December 2023 by the Ministry of Finance in Russia. If you follow the channel, you'll know that we've got extremely limited data coming out of Russia. Russia decided in the early stages of this war that it was a security risk to release detailed financial information, so they've closed down most sources. However, we are still getting official figures published on a monthly basis. So in today's video, we'll go through those official figures and we'll look at how the fall in the value of the ruble and the financial sanctions that have been applied against Russia have really hurt the Russian economy over the last 2 years. 2022 and 2023 have been a complete financial disaster from Russia's point of view, and 2023 has actually got worse than 2022. So the impact of the sanctions and the falling value of the ruble is getting worse, and Russia is continuing to run down its reserves. So in today's video, we'll have a look at what's going on with the value of the ruble, because every single time I post a video like this, I'm inundated with comments from people saying, "What are you talking about? The ruble is doing really well. There is nothing wrong with the Russian economy." So I want to go over exactly where the ruble is right now and compare it to what was happening in 2022 and, more importantly, 2021, which was the last financial year that was unaffected by this war. We'll then have a look at what's happening with oil and gas revenue, which has fallen further in 2023. We'll then talk about the other form of revenue, total revenue, what's happening with expenditure, which has gone through the roof again in December. If you follow the channel, you'll know that in last month's video, we talked about the fact that December seems to be the month that Russia passes a lot of expenditure, and in 2023 it's happened again. We'll then have a look at what the bottom line was for 2023. And finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is going on in the Russian economy right now and how long Russia has left in terms of its reserves if it keeps posting deficits in the same way as it has in 2022 and 2023, which essentially is looking at the question as to how long Russia can keep this war going whilst it's still posting huge deficits. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody that is supporting the channel. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you so much. It really helps to keep the channel going. So before we dive into the financial details of what happened in 2023 with the Russian economy, I wanted to talk about what's happening with the ruble once again, because the message doesn't seem to be getting across. People still seem to think that the ruble is doing really well and that it's performing better than a lot of other currencies. This chart shows the exchange rate between the US dollar and the Russian ruble over the last 5 years. And the reason that I wanted to go back 5 years is to have a look at what happened in 2021, which was the last full year that was unaffected by the war. Russia commenced its invasion on the 24th of February 2022, so the exchange rate was impacted for the majority of 2022 and the entirety of 2023. So if we focus in on the exchange rate for 2021, at the start of the year, $1 was trading for 74 Russian rubles, and the exchange rate remained relatively flat throughout the whole of 2021, and by the end of the year, $1 was trading for 75 rubles, so a very, very small difference between the start and the end of the year. Now, if we draw a line at that exchange rate of $1 to 75 rubles and have a look at what happened in 2022 and 2023, you can see that in the first part of 2022, the exchange rate collapsed from the ruble's perspective, and at one point was trading at almost $1 to 130 rubles. There was then a remarkable bounce back when the Russian central bank stepped in and started buying rubles in the international market. And by June 2022, $1 was trading for around 50 rubles. However, by the end of 2022, $1 was trading for around 72 rubles. If we now look at what's happened in 2023, you can see that there was a continued collapse in the value of the ruble. And by August of 23, $1 was trading for more than 100 rubles. Now that proved to be a bridge too far from President Putin's point of view, and he instructed the Russian central bank to do something about it. And after the introduction of a variety of capital controls, the exchange rate has come down to the current level of around 90 rubles to $1. And if we now go back to compare what's happened in 2023 with the average exchange rate for 2021 of $1 to 75 rubles, you can see that the current exchange rates represent a significant reduction in value, and it is this reduction in value that is really hurting the Russian economy. The yellow section that you can see on this chart highlights how much value the ruble has lost, and therefore proves that the ruble has fallen significantly in value. It may go up on a daily basis. It might rise by 2 or 3% in a single day, but over the last 3 years, it has lost a huge amount of value, and that is hurting Russia. Okay, so before we dive into the detail on what's happened in December 2023, I wanted to remind you where you can find these figures yourself, because these are publicly available on the internet. I don't have any special privileges or a special subscription to receive this information. Everybody can check it out. So hopefully that reduces the amount of flack that people are posting in the comments below saying that I'm making these figures up, because these are published by the Ministry of Finance of Russia. If you go to the web address minfin.gov.ru/EN, if you want to read it in English, /document, it takes you to this page, which are all of the official documents being published by the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. And if you scroll down on the initial page and click on View More, and then you'll need to also click on View More again, because there's been a lot of documents published for December, and go to the document entitled Brief Monthly Information on Federal Budget Execution, cumulative from the beginning of the year in billions of rubles, that was uploaded onto this site on the 17th of January 2024. It gives you the full details of what's being published by Russia. And if you scroll down and then drag the bar at the bottom all the way over to the right-hand side, you will get the latest information for December. Now, this information isn't in a particularly user-friendly format, so I've transposed all of these figures into an Excel spreadsheet and created some graphs, because everybody loves graphs. They're much more interesting to look at. This graph shows Russia's oil and gas revenue for 2021, 2022 and 2023. 21 shown by the grey line, 22 by the orange line and 23 by the blue line. And I've also included the monthly figures here on the chart to make it easier, and these figures are cumulative. So each month adds on top of the previous month's figures to give us the running total, and therefore the figures on the far right hand side of this graph are the full year figures for 2021, 2022 and 2023. And what's obvious from looking at this chart is that Russia earned the most oil and gas revenue in 21, the second most in 22, and the least amount of income from oil and gas in 2023, shown by the blue line at the bottom. The total amount of revenue earned in 2023 was 8.8 trillion rubles, which at the current exchange rate of around 90 to $1 equates to around $100 billion. And that full year figure represents a reduction in revenue of 24% against the income earned in 2022, and an enormous fall of 65% compared with the 25.2 trillion rubles, or around $220 billion, earned in 2021. So you can see from this graph the pain that Russia is now having to bear as a result of both the fall in the value of the ruble and also the financial sanctions that are being applied against Russia. And just to remind you, in case you've forgotten, these are the official figures being published by the Ministry of Finance from Russia. They're not my figures. They're my graphs because I'm using their data, but they are not my figures. Now, in terms of answering the question as to why Russian oil and gas revenue has fallen so significantly, it's partly because the West is no longer buying oil or gas directly from Russia. And even though Russia has managed to achieve increased sales to China and India, it's still having to offer discounts, so it's reducing the price of all of the oil and gas that it is selling. And predominantly on the gas side of things, Russia has really struggled to be able to find alternative sales because it doesn't have enough liquefied natural gas facilities to be able to convert the gas into a liquefied form and therefore put it onto ships and sell it to places like India. And so a lot of the gas that it was previously selling to Europe via pipelines is now just sitting under the ground, dormant. Nothing is happening with it. So Russia has lost a huge amount of revenue as a direct result of the sanctions. Now this chart shows Russia's non-oil and gas revenue for 21, 22 and 23. And the colour scheme is the same here. The grey line is 2021, the orange line 2022 and the blue line 2023. And what's notable about this chart is that it's the exact reverse of what we've just looked at. The figures for 2023 are actually higher than they were in 2022 and remarkably higher than 2021. And the question when you look at this chart is, what is going on here? Non-oil and gas revenue in the year to December 23 was 20.3 trillion rubles, which equates to around $225 billion, which represents an increase of 25% against the same figure for 2022, and an enormous increase of 124% against the figure for 2021. Now, there isn't an explanation in the figures provided by Russia as to what is driving the increase in non-oil and gas revenue. And I think there's a big question mark as to what this is, because predominantly non-oil and gas revenue will relate to things like taxes and other income that the economy is earning that isn't coming directly from oil and gas revenue. And I think the most puzzling thing about this chart is that prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it was widely acknowledged that Russia was an oil and gas economy. That was where it was earning the majority of its money. However, when you look at these figures, it now looks like non-oil and gas is becoming a huge part of the economy. And I think there is a question mark as to what this income is and whether or not these figures are 100% reliable. This chart shows Russia's total revenue for 2023, 2022 and 2021. And total revenue is simply oil and gas revenue plus non-oil and gas revenue. So an amalgamation of the two charts that we've just looked at. And what this chart shows is that total revenue for Russia was the highest in 2021. 2023 was actually the second highest out of these 3 years, and the lowest revenue was seen in 2022. Total revenue in 2023 was 29.1 trillion rubles, which equates to around $325 billion. And that figure represents a 5% increase against the total revenue for 2022. However, it is down 15% against total revenue for 2021. And as we've just discussed, the main driver for the fall in total revenue against the figures for 2021 is the enormous fall of 65% in oil and gas revenue, which has been partially offset by the increase in non-oil and gas revenue. And unfortunately, we don't have a full explanation as to what's driving the non-oil and gas increase. But if we take a step back and look at this chart, you can see that the impact of the sanctions and the fall in the value of the ruble is still hurting the Russian economy. Total revenue is down against where Russia was before this war started. This chart shows total expenditure for the Russian economy for 23, 22 and 21. And unfortunately, we don't have a detailed breakdown of what this expenditure is going into. In the past, Russia did provide that information. However, following the invasion of Ukraine, it stopped providing us with any details. So we don't know exactly how much of this expenditure is going on the war in Ukraine. However, it is likely to be a large percentage. And as you can see, in terms of what's happened during the year, December is a remarkable month in terms of expenditure because there is a noticeable increase in expenditure in the month. You can see that there is a kink in the line in all 3 of these years. Russia's total expenditure in the 12 months of 2023 was 32.4 trillion rubles, which equates to around $360 billion. So this was the highest figure out of all 3 years and represents an increase of 4% against the expenditure figure for 2022 and a whopping 31% increase against the expenditure for 2021. And clearly, a lot of that increase compared with 2021 will be down to the war in Ukraine because Russia was not at war in 2021. This chart shows the net profit or deficit figure for Russia for 21, 22 and 23. And as you can see, in 2023, Russia has been in deficit in every single month. It's been posting losses continually throughout the year. And if you look at the shape of all three of these charts, you can see the impact of the large amount of expenditure that's passed in December each year, because we've got a downward turn in the total figures for every single year. And the total loss for 2023 was 3.2 trillion rubles, which equates to around $36 billion, which is a slight improvement on the 3.3 trillion that Russia lost in 2022. However, in 2022, the average exchange rate was around $1 to 70 rubles. So the US dollar equivalent of the loss last year was around $47 billion. So over the last 2 years, Russia has posted cumulative losses of $83 billion. And that compares to a huge profit that Russia posted in 2021 of 9.6 trillion rubles, which was around $128 billion at the exchange rate of $1 to 75 rubles. So the full year outturn for 2023 actually represents a reduction of $164 billion from a profit of $128 billion in 21 to a loss of $36 billion in 2023. And clearly the issue here from Russia's point of view is that losses like this are unsustainable. Russia does not have an unlimited amount of reserves, and therefore if it keeps posting deficits, at some point its reserves will run out and it will run out of cash. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we only get a very limited amount of official data coming out from Russia, and these monthly figures are the most reliable that we have. This is telling us exactly what Russia wants to post as its public figures. And what we've seen from the data for 2023 is that things are still very bad in the Russian economy. It's posted a net loss of $36 billion for the full year, but the downturn in oil and gas revenue represents a shortfall of around 65% against where Russia was for 2021. And that's the benchmark year here, because that's the only year that we have out of the last 3 that have been unaffected by the war in Ukraine. Now, 65% fall in revenue is absolutely enormous. And when you combine that with the huge increase in expenditure that Russia has posted as a result of the war in Ukraine, because it's spending a lot on keeping that war going, you would have expected the net loss to have been absolutely huge. But there's been a really interesting movement in terms of non-oil and gas revenue. And as I've said throughout this video, I can't really explain it because it doesn't really make sense. Russia is dependent on oil and gas revenue. That is a fact. Everybody knows that. So if its oil and gas revenue is down 65%, you would have expected the net loss to be down much more than that. But Russia seems to have come up with income from other sources to offset that loss. And when you look at what's happened with total revenue, it's almost the same as what it was in 2021, which does seem a little bit unbelievable. However, let's take these figures at face value. A loss for the full financial year of $36 billion is a disaster from Russia's point of view, and that's on top of a loss of $47 billion posted in 2023. So over the last 2 years, Russia has posted combined losses of $83 billion. Now, at the start of this conflict, there was a lot of analysis done in terms of Russia's reserves. Russia lost around $300 billion of overseas assets, money that it had in overseas bank accounts that has now been seized by the West. But it was estimated that Russia had around $150 billion in its national wealth fund, and it could use that money to fund the war in Ukraine. So assuming that it's taken $83 billion out of that figure of 150, Russia now has less than $70 billion left to keep funding this war. Now, based on a $36 billion loss for 2023, that would mean that Russia would have around 2 years' worth of funding left to keep the war in Ukraine going. But all of that is based on the principle of an increase in non-oil and gas revenue that Russia has been posting. And does that relate to cash? Is that real money? Is that money that Russia can use to fund the war in Ukraine? or is it just an accounting entry to make the figures look better? Obviously, I don't have an answer to that question, but there is a major question mark as to where that increase in non-oil and gas revenue has come from and whether or not it's in real cash. The other issue that Russia is also facing is that the increase in trade that it's done with China and India has actually led to a huge increase in Russia's reserves of Indian rupees, UAE dirhams, and Chinese yuan. And there's a question as to whether or not Russia can use that money to keep the war in Ukraine going, whether or not it'll be able to repatriate that money and convert it into rubles to pay for things in Russia, or if it's just going to have to use it as credit for more trade with those countries. So there's a lot of questions here as to what Russia has in terms of cash, where that cash is, and whether or not they can use it to fund the war in Ukraine. But the overall summary of today's video is that the official figures published by the Ministry of Finance for Russia show that in 2023, oil and gas revenue was down by 65% against the figures for 2021, and the net loss for the year posted of $36 billion means that Russia's reserves have fallen once again. It's running short of cash, and at some point, if this situation continues, Russia will run out of cash, and that will be a major disaster both for the Russian economy and also for the war effort in Ukraine. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.